It's a beautiful day in this neighborhood, a beautiful day for a neighbor. Would you be mine? Could you be mine? It's a neighborly day in this beauty wood, a neighborly day for a beauty. Would you be mine? Could you be mine?
Won't You Be My Neighbor? 50 years of breaking barriers in Mr. Rogers' neighborhood. Beginning in 1968, Fred Rogers created Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, which was his vision of ideal educational television programming for children. Through Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, he was able to break educational, religious, political, racial, and social barriers through his innovative platform. Fred Rogers impacted America not only with his kindness, but also with his courage to break barriers in front of a national audience. Fred Rogers launched his 6-decade television career in 1951 when he was home on college break and experienced television for the first time. He was dismayed at the low quality of programming he saw. Newton Minow, head of the FCC, echoed that sentiment in 1961, calling TV a vast wasteland.
I saw this new thing called television. And I saw people throwing pies in each other's faces. And I thought, this could be a wonderful tool for education. Why is it being used this way?
Creating children's television programming in the volatile decade of the 1960s did not discourage Fred Rogers. Political backlash from the civil rights movement caused riots and police mistrust. National turmoil erupted when Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy were assassinated. Finally, the violence of the Vietnam War was ever present on television. Mr. Rogers' radical approach for this time period aimed to reach kids on an emotional level, a need that Rogers believed had to be met before any learning could occur. Other shows like Ding Dong School, Sesame Street, and Captain Kangaroo lacked this important focus. Starting in 1968, when Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood first aired until its final show in 2001, Fred Rogers would break barriers in ways no one would have expected from a man using simple homemade puppets and wearing a cardigan sweater knitted by his mother. Fred Rogers had a pioneering vision for children's programming. Maxwell King wrote in his biography, The Good Neighbor, it was decades before the field of early education and children's television caught up to Rogers. He was very much concerned with the social and emotional well-being of children, and that was in contradistinction to the time. Fred Rogers used the teachings of educational experts, including Margaret McFarland, to impose powerful lessons. Rogers presented science, technology, engineering, art, and math activities decades before it was labeled as STEM. Touring factories, thinking out loud, or even visiting a doctor all helped children break the barriers in their environment. Fred Rogers, an ordained Presbyterian minister, also broke the barrier of ministry by having a TV audience of millions of children as his congregation instead of people in church pews. He wanted to spread his gospel through the magic box in everyone's living rooms. Emily Olrin of the Fred Rogers Institute stated, he was ordained to communicate with children through television, which was something that hadn't been done before. Besides breaking educational barriers, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood supported the feminist movement, breaking this barrier years before the Equal Rights Amendment would even reach Congress. In the neighborhood of make-believe, when King Friday married commoner Queen Saturday, she kept her own last name. Another bold feminist move by Rogers was casting a black female leader as the mayor of Westwood. Additionally, Fred Rogers broke barriers in mental health by offering a way for children to channel their emotions constructively. In his neighborhood of make-believe, they were able to break down emotional issues to a child's level of understanding. Each puppet represented a personality trait. Daniel Tiger was timid, Lady Elaine was a troublemaker, and King Friday the 13th was controlling. Rogers' work was revolutionary, viewing children's emotions as being complex, which was contrary to common thinking. Fred Rogers was quoted as saying, "If someone would have told me we would have done a whole series on divorce, I wouldn't have believed it." This was yet another barrier that Rogers was not afraid to tackle. He wanted to reassure children that divorce was not their fault. Neighborhood puppets King Friday and Queen Saturday had fights, but angry times didn't always end in divorce.
It shows you have a lot of things happen to you when you're handicapped, most of the time. And sometimes it happens when you're not handicapped.
Of course. But you're able to talk about those things so well and help other people who might have the same kinds of things.
This iconic episode about disabilities was Mr. Rogers' personal favorite. Jeffrey Erlanger was a quadriplegic that Mr. Rogers invited to the neighborhood to discuss his electric wheelchair. This 1981 barrier-breaking episode offered a voice to people with disabilities and preceded the 1990 Americans with Disabilities Act by a decade. The neighborhood also welcomed the recurring characters of Chef Brockett and Chrissy Thompson, who live with disabilities as well. Chef Brockett discussed his limp stemming from hip issues, while Chrissy lived with spina bifida. Mr. Rogers also confronted the seldom talked about barrier of death when his pet goldfish unexpectedly died. He talked about death, loss, and the sadness that comes with it instead of just replacing the fish unknowingly. Rogers also played a role in breaking another barrier, the one of violence on television. In 1993, he reported that children are exposed to 200,000 acts of television violence by the time they turn 18. Rogers wanted this drama of violence to be replaced by the constructive drama of childhood. Rogers effectively used the neighborhood of make-believe to talk about these scary topics. He wanted to show how misunderstanding and stubbornness often led to a crisis. He addressed the Vietnam War, the Cold War, the nuclear arms race, and even immigration. King Friday the 13th posted border guards and ordered bombs to be built, ironically using social program funding for this. He also built a castle barrier to address immigration. Rogers tried to parallel the absurdity of the political decisions of the time and make the case for breaking the barrier of violence so that there could be peace in the world. In the book Peaceful Neighbor, biographer Michael Long characterized Rogers as one of the most radical pacifists of contemporary history. Rogers even taped a public service announcement about 9/11 to urge children to look for the helpers.
Well, that was so enjoyable. I'm sorry I couldn't stay longer.
Well, I know how busy you are, but sometimes just a minute like this will really make a difference.
Mr. Rogers was instrumental in breaking the barrier of race. He challenged deep-rooted racial barriers by casting Officer Clemens as a black man, keeping the neighborhood safe. This pool scene and ones where black and white children played together in the neighborhood were unheard of in the 1960s.
To say that he didn't know what he was doing, or that he accidentally stumbled into integration or talking about racism or sexism, that's not Mr. Rogers. It was well planned and well thought out, and I think it was very impactful.
Additionally, Rogers hired a diverse cast for the show. Officer Clemens and Mayor Maggie were black, Tony Chiroldes was Hispanic, and Chef Brockett was disabled. Rogers also hired talented women like Lady Aberlin. All of these decisions helped to break through inclusion barriers. He was also a technological innovator, using television as no one had ever done before. Spanning 4 decades, his show reached 10% of American households with 5 to 10 million daily viewers. While raising the bar for children's programming, Fred Rogers also made many economic, political, social, and educational impacts. When Rogers testified before Congress in 1969, he made economic and political impacts by securing ongoing funding for public television. Were it not for Fred Rogers, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting would not be operating with a budget of over $400 million today. Likewise, Rogers also argued before the Supreme Court in 1984 that people should have the right to record using their VCR without violating fair use copyright law. His testimony helped ensure DVR use today. Rogers had a tremendous social and educational impact during his lifetime. He offered a philosophy of social acceptance that resonated. He broke inclusion barriers, resulting in some of the disability accommodations we see in our schools today. You can even see his blueprint in shows like Blue's Clues and Dora the Explorer. His legacy continues directly with the PBS show Daniel Tiger's Neighborhood.
I'd just like to be remembered for being a compassionate human being who happened to be fortunate enough to be born at a time when there was this fabulous thing called television.
Journalist Mary Elizabeth Williams characterized Fred Rogers by stating, "One of the most radical figures of contemporary history, never ran a country or led a battle. He became a legend by wearing a cardigan and taking off his shoes."